Detective James Mercer had framed dozens, but this time he picked the wrong woman, and her lawyer had been waiting years for revenge. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Detective James Mercer strode through the precinct with the confidence of a man who owned the place. 15 years on the force had taught him the system, who to befriend, who to intimidate, and most importantly, how to cover his tracks. His arrest record was impressive, his complaint file mysteriously thin, and his reputation among fellow officers untarnished, despite the whispers that followed him through the halls. The morning sun filtered through Venetian blinds as Mercer sorted through paperwork on his cluttered desk. Coffee cup in hand, he flipped open a case file labeled Preston Alicia. A smile crept across his face. Another easy win. Another notch on his belt. The drug possession charges were minor, but with her prior record, he could push for maximum. Sentencing. The DA's office trusted his testimony implicitly. Why wouldn't they? He was Detective James Mercer. "You ready for court?" Lieutenant Dawson asked, leaning against the doorframe of Mercer's office. "That Preston case should be straightforward." Mercer nodded, adjusting his tie. "Always am. Woman doesn't stand a chance. Public defender fresh out of law school. Evidence. In my favor, judge who owes me a favor. I'll be back for lunch." "Don't get cocky," Dawson warned. "I heard her lawyer changed last minute." "Doesn't matter who represents her," Mercer replied, grabbing his jacket. "My word against hers, and we both know whose word carries more weight in a courtroom." Alicia Preston sat in the courthouse holding area, hands clasped tightly in her lap. At 32, her life had been a series of wrong turns and bad luck. This arrest, however, felt different. She hadn't possessed any drugs that night, despite what Detective Mercer claimed in his report. The memory of his smirk as he planted evidence in her purse burned in her mind. "Ms. Preston?" a voice called, interrupting her thoughts. "I'm Catherine Chen. I'll be representing you today." Alicia looked up to see a woman in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. This wasn't the overwhelmed public defender she'd met last week. "There's been a change," Catherine explained, reading Alicia's confusion. "I've taken your case pro bono. I reviewed the arrest report and have some concerns about Detective Mercer's account." "He planted that stuff on me," Alicia whispered, eyes darting around the room. "But it's my word against his. Nobody's going to believe me." Catherine's expression hardened slightly. "You'd be surprised. This isn't my first encounter with Detective Mercer. In fact, I've been collecting information on him for quite some time." "Who are you?" Alicia asked. "Someone who knows what it's like to be on the wrong side of a corrupt system," Catherine replied, "and someone who has the resources to fight back. Before I became an attorney, I was an investigative journalist. Old habits die hard." The courtroom hushed as Judge Franklin entered. Detective Mercer sat confidently behind the prosecution table, exchanging familiar nods with the district attorney. When his eyes landed on Catherine Chen, however, his expression faltered momentarily. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Franklin. Case number 47829, State versus Alicia Preston," the bailiff announced. The proceedings began routinely enough. The prosecution outlined their case: drug possession, resisting arrest, the defendant's prior record suggesting a pattern of criminal behavior. Detective Mercer took the stand with practiced ease, recounting the night of the arrest with the polished delivery of someone who had testified hundreds of times before. "And you discovered the narcotics in Miss Preston's purse during a legal search of her property?" the prosecutor asked. "That's correct," Mercer affirmed. "Clear plastic bag containing approximately 28 grams of cocaine in the inner pocket of her handbag." "No further questions, Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, satisfied. Judge Franklin turned to the defense table. "Your witness, counselor." Catherine stood slowly, buttoning her jacket. "Detective Mercer, how long have you been with the department?" 15 years next month," he answered proudly. And in those 15 years, how many complaints have been filed against you? The prosecutor jumped to his feet. Objection. Relevance? I'm establishing the witness's credibility, Your Honor, Catherine replied calmly. I'll allow it, Judge, Franklin said, his interest piqued. Answer the question, Detective. Mercer shifted in his seat. A few. Nothing substantiated. 18 complaints, to be exact, Catherine corrected, including 3 for evidence tampering and 5 for excessive force. All mysteriously dropped or ruled unfounded. Catherine approached the bench, presenting a file to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence in this case. Evidence that directly contradicts Detective Mercer's testimony. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Catherine presented security camera footage from a convenience store across the A street from where Alicia was arrested. The timestamp matched the night in question, clearly showing Detective Mercer removing something from his own pocket before the search of Alicia's purse. Additionally, Catherine continued, her voice echoing through the now silent courtroom, I've obtained testimonies from 7 other individuals with nearly identical stories, all arrested by Detective Mercer, all claiming planted evidence, all with records that made them unlikely to be believed over a decorated officer. Mercer's face drained of color as Catherine produced a USB drive. This contains body cam footage that mysteriously never made it into evidence. Footage that Detective Mercer believed was deleted, but was actually backed up to the department server. Footage that clearly shows him planting evidence in my client's possession. Judge Franklin's expression hardened as he examined the evidence. Mr. Prosecutor, approach the bench. Detective Mercer, you will remain on the stand. The gallery erupted in murmurs as the judge, prosecutor, and defense attorney conferred in hushed tones. Mercer sat rigid, his eyes darting between the exits, the evidence in the judge's hands and the calm, steady gaze of Catherine Chen. Case dismissed, Judge Franklin announced when order was restored. Ms. Preston, you are free to go. Detective Mercer, you are to surrender your badge and firearm to court security immediately. Bailiff, please detain the detective pending charges of evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations. The courtroom erupted in chaos as 2 court officers approached Mercer. For a moment he considered resistance, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon, but the determined expressions of the officers and the weight of the evidence against him proved too overwhelming. As Mercer was led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Catherine Chen. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Catherine approached him calmly. 7 years ago, you arrested my younger brother on false charges. He spent 3 years in prison before I could prove his innocence. By then, his life was destroyed. He died of an overdose 6 months after his release. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I promised him I would expose you. I've been building this case ever since, waiting for you to make another mistake. And you did, Detective. You brought the wrong woman to court today. 3 months after Detective James Mercer's dramatic courtroom downfall, Alicia Preston pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the West Side Community Center. The autumn air carried a sense of renewal that seemed fitting for the occasion. The building, once a neglected municipal space, had been transformed into the headquarters of the newly formed Justice Accountability Project. Tonight marked their 3rd community meeting, and already the attendance had swelled to over 100 people. Alicia paused at the entrance, taking in the scene before her. Rows of folding chairs filled with people from all walks of life, united by a common thread of injustice at the hands of those sworn to protect them. The nervous energy in the room was palpable, electric with the possibility of change, however fragile that hope might be. Catherine Chen stood at the podium, her posture as impeccable as it had been that fateful day in court. In the months since Mercer's arrest, she had transformed from a private attorney into a public figure, the face of a movement that was rapidly gaining momentum across the city. Her professional attire remained, but gone was the cautious restraint of a courtroom tactician. In its place was the assured presence of someone who had finally stepped into their purpose. The Justice Accountability Project had started as a one-woman mission of vengeance for her brother, but it had evolved into something far greater, a coalition of attorneys, former prosecutors, investigative journalists, civil rights activists, and victims united in their commitment to expose corruption within the justice system. Since Detective Mercer's arrest, Catherine was saying as Alicia found an empty seat near the front, 16 of his previous cases have been overturned by the appeals court. 42 more are currently under review. The district attorney's office has established a dedicated unit to investigate potentially tainted convictions, not just from Mercer, but from any officer connected to him. She paused, letting the significance of these developments sink in. For many of you in this room, this represents the first acknowledgement from the system that you were wronged. I understand that no overturned conviction can restore the years lost, the opportunities missed, or the trauma endured. But it is a beginning, a crack in the foundation of impunity that has protected corrupt officers for decades. The projector behind Catherine displayed a series of newspaper headlines documenting the expanding investigation. What had begun with one detective had metastasized into a departmental cancer. In the weeks following Mercer's arrest, Internal Affairs had seized records from the 4th Precinct, uncovering a pattern of misconduct that stretched back nearly 2 decades. 6 additional officers had been suspended pending investigation. The police commissioner had resigned under pressure. City council members were calling for independent oversight. It was, as one political commentator had described it, the most significant police accountability moment in the city's history. Our work is just beginning, Catherine continued, her voice carrying to the back of the crowded room. One corrupt officer has been held accountable, but the system that protected him remains largely intact. The blue wall of silence didn't develop overnight, and it won't be dismantled in a single case. What Detective Mercer and his colleagues understood, what they counted on, was our isolation. They targeted those they believed would never find common cause, never compare notes, never build the collective power necessary to challenge them. They were wrong. Alicia settled into her chair, no longer the frightened woman she had been in that courthouse holding area just months earlier. The transformation had been gradual but profound. After her case was dismissed, she had initially struggled with the aftermath of her near brush with injustice. Nightmares about prison cells and corrupt officers had plagued her sleep. She'd jump at the sight of patrol cars in her rearview mirror. The lingering trauma had nearly driven her back to the numbing escape of substances she'd worked so hard to leave behind. But Catherine had connected her with resources, a trauma therapist specializing in police misconduct cases, a support group for those wrongfully accused, and eventually, a job at the Riverside Recovery Center where her lived experience was valued, rather than stigmatized. Last week, Alicia had testified at Mercer's grand jury hearing, her voice steady and sure as she recounted the night of her arrest in excruciating detail. The prosecutor had warned her that the defense would attack her credibility, emphasize her prior record, suggest she was seeking revenge or financial gain. But those attempts at character assassination had fallen flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence Catherine had compiled. The body camera footage that Mercer thought he had deleted showed him clearly removing a plastic bag from his own pocket before discovering it in Alicia's purse. His confident smirk as he told her, "Nobody's going to believe you over me," was now evidence of his consciousness of guilt rather than a prophecy. The grand jury had returned indictments on 27 felony counts. Catherine was now introducing a panel of speakers, AFAS's former Internal Affairs investigator who had been forced into early retirement after attempting to report misconduct, a forensic accountant tracking suspicious patterns in police asset forfeiture cases, a data scientist who had developed an algorithm identifying statistical anomalies in officers' arrest records that might indicate falsified reports. The Justice Accountability Project was bringing scientific rigor to what had previously been dismissed as anecdotal complaints. After the panel finished, Catherine opened the floor for questions and comments. Several attendees shared their stories, each one echoing elements of Alicia's experience. Evidence that appeared from nowhere, pressure to plead guilty to lesser charges rather than risk trial, the devastating consequences that rippled through their lives long after the legal proceedings had ended. An elderly woman broke down in tears, describing how her grandson had died in custody after being denied medication. A middle-aged man explained how a fabricated drug charge had cost him his commercial driver's license and consequently his livelihood. These stories had always existed in the community, but they had rarely been given such a platform, such validation. When the formal portion of the meeting concluded, attendees broke into smaller discussion groups. Catherine made her way through the crowd, stopping to speak with people individually, her legal pad filling with notes about potential new cases to investigate. When she reached Alicia, her professional demeanor softened slightly. "How are you? Holding up?" she asked, genuine concern in her eyes. "Better," Alicia replied, and she meant it. "The job at the recovery center is working out. Turns out my experience actually helps me connect with clients. And being here, talking to the others, it helps to know I wasn't alone, that it wasn't something about me specifically that made Mercer target me." She hesitated, then added, "Though sometimes I still wonder why he picked me that night. There must have been dozens of people he could have stopped." Catherine considered this. Based on his previous pattern, he was probably under pressure to make his monthly arrest quota. Your prior record made you vulnerable, a convenient target who could be discredited if you tried to fight back. She shook her head. "It's never random, but it's rarely personal. It's systematic." "That almost makes it worse," Alicia observed. "Being collateral damage in someone else's career advancement strategy." Catherine nodded in understanding. "Would you be willing to share your story at the Police Reform Commission hearing next month? The City Council is considering legislation to restructure the complaint review process, and personal testimonies could make a real difference in how they vote." Alicia hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'm not afraid anymore. That's what he took from me that night, my sense of security, my belief that the truth matters. I want to help make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Plus," she added with a small smile, "public speaking can't be more terrifying than testifying against Mercer." "You were brilliant in there," Catherine assured her. "The prosecutor told me afterward that your testimony was what convinced several hesitant grand jurors." As they continued their conversation, Alicia noticed a growing commotion near the entrance. Attendees were gathering around the wall-mounted television, which was tuned to the local news. Catherine followed her gaze, and they made their way to the back of the room, where a news broadcast was showing live footage from outside police headquarters. On screen, Captain Raymond Dawson, Mercer's former supervisor and longtime defender, was being led out of the building in handcuffs, his expression a mask of defiance. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking, police captain arrested on corruption charges, evidence sharing with Justice Accountability Project credited." Did you know this was happening today? Alicia asked, stunned by the development. Catherine's expression revealed nothing, but there was a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "Let's just say I had a productive meeting with the FBI last week. Turns out Mercer kept meticulous records of every officer who helped him cover up misconduct. Once he realized he was facing 20 years, he became surprisingly cooperative." "Did you know it would go this far when you took my case?" Alicia pressed. "That it wouldn't just be about Mercer?" Catherine watched the broadcast with grim satisfaction as the reporter detailed allegations that Captain Dawson had systematically buried complaints against officers in his precinct in exchange for a percentage of assets seized during questionable arrests. "Justice rarely stops with one person," she replied thoughtfully. "Corruption thrives in shadows and silence. All we did was turn on the lights. Mercer was never the disease. He was just the most visible symptom." The evening news anchor returned to the screen, announcing that former Detective James Mercer had entered a guilty plea that afternoon, agreeing to testify against superior officers in exchange for a reduced sentence. The footage cut to a courthouse sketch of Mercer at the defendant's table, his once imposing frame now diminished in civilian clothes, the artist capturing perfectly the hollowness in his eyes, the look of a man who had finally confronted the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, Alicia allowed herself a genuine smile, not of vindication, but of profound relief. The badge that had once made James Mercer untouchable now lay tarnished in an evidence locker, proof that no one stands above the law forever. More importantly, the story that had begun with her unjust arrest was expanding into something far more significant than personal redemption. It was becoming a blueprint for systemic change. As the meeting drew to a close, Catherine handed Alicia a business card. "The Justice Accountability Project is expanding," she explained. "We need people who understand both sides of the system, who've experienced its failures firsthand, but still believe in the possibility of its reform. If you're interested, there's a community outreach position opening next month." Alicia accepted the card, running her fingers over the embossed logo, a scale of justice being held not by the traditional blindfolded figure, but by many hands working together. "I'll think about it," she promised, though they both knew her decision was already made. Outside the community center, the autumn evening had turned cool, stars emerging in the darkening sky. Across the street, more news vans were setting up for the evening broadcast, testament to how the story of police corruption had captured public attention. Change was coming to the department, to the courts, to the city itself, slowly and imperfectly perhaps, but with increasing momentum. And for Alicia Preston, whose life had nearly been destroyed by a detective who thought his badge made him untouchable, that knowledge was enough to face tomorrow with something she had long forgotten: hope.